Hi, my name is Anna Lappé, and I am so pleased to be beaming in for the second year of this virtual Oxford Real Farming Conference. And once again, I am moderating a conversation with the wonderful Raj Patel and Dr. Rupa Marya. I'm zooming in from the San Francisco Bay Area, specifically what's known today as Berkeley, California, the unceded land of the Ohlone people, where I work with food movement partners, both in the US and around the world, through two organizations, a communication strategy and popular education nonprofit called Real Food Media, and a family foundation based here in the area where I lead the Food Sovereignty Fund. I could not be more delighted to start this new year by hearing from two of my favorite thinkers and doers, Rupa Marya and Raj Patel. In our time together, we'll be hearing about their new co-written book, Inflamed. I have a beautiful copy right here, one of my favorite book covers of late. And we'll be hearing their powerful case making about the links between health, medicine, food, and social justice, and the need for radical systems change. We are planning to use the first half of our time together to hear from Rupa and Raj, and after they speak, I will be asking them some follow-up questions, and then we'll turn it over to all of you to hear your questions and where you'd like us to take the conversation. So at the bottom of your screen, you will see a Q&A area, and that's where you can put questions that will field the second half of our conversation. So before turning it over to Rupa and then to Raj, I want to just introduce you to these two incredible human beings in case you aren't familiar with their work. Dr. Rupa Marya is a physician, an activist, a writer, mother, and a composer. She's an associate professor of medicine at the University of California, San Francisco, where she practices and teaches internal medicine. She's the founder of the Deep Medicine Circle, a worker-directed organization of Indigenous and non-Indigenous people committed to healing the wounds of colonialism through food, medicine, story, and restoration. She also co-founded the Do No Harm Coalition, a collective of health workers committed to addressing disease through structural change. And at the invitation of Lakota health leaders, Rupa continues to support communities at Standing Rock in their work to decolonize medicine and food. But there's more. She is also an amazing musician and has toured 29 countries with her band Rupa and the April Fishes. So after our conversation together today, if you want to boost your energy for the rest of the day, you can find some of Rupa's amazing music online and give yourself that little treat. Raj Patel is a research professor at the University of Texas at Austin's Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs, a professor in the university's Department of Nutrition, and a research associate at Rhodes University, South Africa. In addition, he serves on the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems and has advised governments on causes and solutions to the crisis of sustainability worldwide. Prior to his latest book with Rupa, he's also the author of several other fabulous books. I recommend reading them all. They're called Stuffed and Starved, The Value of Nothing, and A History of the World in 7 Cheap Things. But wait, there's more with Raj as well. He is also a filmmaker and the co-director of the award-winning new film, The Ants and the Grasshopper, which is screening at this conference. We'll put a link into the chat of how you can find that screening and tune into it and hear Raj speak in a Q&A after that film. So yes, these, as you can hear, and if you already know their work, you already know this, these two people have done and are doing incredible work in the world. But as someone privileged to call them each a friend, I can also tell you that they are both kind and generous people whose approach to their relationships and being in community is a reflection of their commitment to radical solidarity. So I'm just delighted to have them both here, and I will start by turning it over to Rupa. And I was hoping she could start by kind of giving us a big picture understanding of this concept that Raj and Rupa worked on. But I want to also add, I mentioned this in my introduction to you, Rupa. Rupa is a working doctor. So that blank wall you see behind her is a hospital wall. She's been on duty for a couple hours so far today and has stepped aside to be in conversation with us while one of her colleagues holds her pager. So this work is so deeply real for Rupa and really connected to what literally she's doing today in the hospital. And so I thought, Rupa, we could start by having you help all of us understand from this perspective of being a healthcare practitioner, of trying to truly generate health for people, community. If you could just start by helping us understand this framework that you and Raj bring together in this book called Inflamed, this framework of inflammation, why is that so powerful to both of you? And if you could just start there, and then I'll come back and we'll turn it over to Raj.
Yes, thank you, Anna, and thank you to the conference for having us back again this year. I am speaking to you from the unceded occupied territory of Ramaytush lands in what is now called San Francisco, what was called Yelamu for over 10,000 years before this place was colonized by Europeans. I am sitting in the hospital office at the University of California, San Francisco, where I work as a hospital medicine doctor. And we're here in the midst of this Omicron surge, watching the virus change its expression. But throughout its movements through our bodies has left us inflamed. And so for myself and Raj, we've been looking at, myself as a physician have noticed over the last 20 years of my practice, of my clinical practice, how different bodies are expressing disease. And what we've learned in the last 20 years is how most of the diseases I treat as a hospital medicine doctor are diseases where inflammation is playing a role, and that the scourge of chronic inflammation underlies most of the diseases of modern industrialized societies, the ones that we face. So whether we're talking about heart disease, cardiovascular disease, cancer, COPD, asthma, autoimmune disease, inflammatory bowel disease, and even COVID and severe COVID. These are these are diseases where there is this inflammatory response going in the body. And so Raj and I started to look at, what's causing this inflammation, and why is it so prevalent in societies that have been structured through colonial capitalism and through an economic and social mindset that privileges certain individuals over others. And in the midst of Omicron, as we watched, San Francisco going from the most lauded response in the nation to now the mayor telling us yesterday, basically, good luck, do what you can to not catch COVID. There is this emphasis on individual responsibility, individual, if you get COVID, it's kind of your fault. People are saying they feel ashamed, as opposed to looking at the structures and the structural causes of pandemic, the structural causes of who's getting sick and how they're getting sick, and actually how to prevent people from getting sick is what really drove us to look at these questions in this book. And what we found is that inflammatory disease is not just being caused by, your poor diet and your poor choices, but by the whole structures around the body that are driving this kind of illness. And we detail it, in painful detail for some people who are not used to reading science in the book. And we wanted to give everybody this scientific understanding of what's happening on the cellular level in response to toxic social structures, because we believe it's important for us to understand how these structures are impacting our bodies so that we can together design better systems where health can actually be possible.
Thanks, Rupa. And thanks, everyone. I put this in the chat, but thank you, everyone, for joining us and for engaging in the chat. I want to turn it over to you, Raj, now. And, we're here together at the Oxford Real Farming Conference. And, of course, there is this clear connection that you make in the book between these themes that Rupa talked about inflammation in our bodies and how that connects, as Rupa said, to these structures outside of our bodies, to these toxic social structures, and of course, how all of that connects to food and food systems. And so I wonder if you could carry the conversation toward how these themes connect to how we are thinking about our food system globally, and that connection to inflammation?
Well, thank you for the question, Anna. Thank you, ORFC team. Thank y'all for joining us, and it's good to be back with you, Rupa. Now I'm talking to you from what's currently called Austin, Texas. Texas, of course, the state in the Union that fought for slavery twice, and which is in turn, in this particular part of what is currently called North America, originally Tonkawa, and then before that Isleta del Sur Pueblo territory. And I think it's important just to observe why it is that we're talking about whose land this is, because we'll come to this a little later on, but colonialism matters in the food system. And that's a useful way of getting into this discussion around inflammation, because often when I've seen inflammation crop up in discussions around the food system, it's because people are very excited about anti-inflammatory diets. And this is a good thing. I mean, who wants inflammatory diets when you could have something that actually helps your colon settle down a little? The trouble is that the way we think about anti-inflammatory diets in general tends to be as an individual practice. And that means that, what we'll do is go out to the farmer's market. We love the farmer's market. Everyone loves the farmer's market. And we'll go there and we'll find something that is local and sustainable and organic and regenerative and, God forbid, agroecological. And we will make sure that workers have been treated with dignity and that the land has been rematriated and everything about it is fantastic. And yet we will consume these products as a sort of individual therapy. And as a way of sort of calming down our bowels, as an anti-inflammatory treatment. Now, look, at some level, there isn't another way than by eating better to, in the first instance, address some of the damage that has been caused to our bodies and to our relationships with one another through industrial capitalism and through the industrial food system, than by eating better and by eating in the ways that are consonant with reknitting our relationships together in the web of life. But if we just think of food as a pill, rather than understanding that medicine is not just the sort of medical device of kale, but also the web of relationships that produce it and sustain our bodies and our relationships, then we're missing a beat. And as I say, we'll get into sort of thinking about colonialism a little later on, but maybe now's a good time just to sort of relay an anecdote about anti-inflammatory disease that Rupa and I predicted in the book. So in Inflamed, one of the things that we observed is that there's a lot of discussion at the moment about the microbiome. Everyone's excited to discover that they have one, and then dismayed to realize that if you live in cities, particularly cities in the global north, that your microbiome isn't in general as diverse as microbiomes of indigenous people who live with a far richer web of life than we ourselves have, living in urban areas in the global north. So what some enterprising medics at Stanford have done, medics and anthropologists, is to essentially steal the poop of indigenous people, particularly the Yanomami people in the Amazon, and to essentially turn it into a pill, which then you can pop into your mouth and which rewilds your microbiome. And this has some anti-inflammatory effects. And this sounds fantastic. What we're going to do is just rewild and repopulate our internal microbiome through the administration of certain kinds of pill and medicine. But of course, this is to repeat histories of colonial theft that stretch back for as long as, that stretch back to Columbus, where indigenous people have things and Columbus wonders how much they are worth. I mean, that's one of the first things that Columbus writes in his diary, that he laments when he arrives in the New World, that he sees all these plants and sees all these animals, and he does not know what they are worth. And so this, I observed this to say, look, there are ways of thinking about inflammation that correctly understand the inflammation in our bodies, not just in our guts, but in our bodies in toto, as products of a dysfunctional food system, a food system that's quite happy to treat the land and us with all kinds of inflammatory chemistry. And inflammatory relationships, and with the annihilation of species, and with the destruction of biodiversity that leaves our microbiome denuded. But the treatment for that diagnosis is not then to just rewild our microbiome and pay no attention to the relationships around us. What we point out in Inflamed is that those relationships with other human beings and other beings in the web of life, other people in the web of life, are central to our becoming healthier. And so rather than encourage us to just say, look, yes, let's rewild ourselves and let's just get some mud under our fingers and sort of pop it into our mouth, what we need is far more global, far more systemic transformation. And I'm excited for us to get into the conversation about what that might be, because it does mean shifting the food system entirely and not merely taking individual elements within the framework of the current food system, but actually getting rid of the industrial food system entirely.
Thanks, Raj. I love that description you were talking about of shifting from food as a pill or the kind of medical device of kale to thinking about it as thinking about these webs of relationship. And so I want to pick up on that theme as I turn it back to you, Rupa, to have you carry on from what Raj was talking about this, the need, as Raj was saying, and as you both talk about in this book, of this systemic transformation. So we're not talking about that individual body, the rewilding of an individual on its own, in its own body, but really about systems, about populations, about communities. And so I wonder, Rupa, if you want to talk about how you see this playing out, maybe in some of the work that you all have been doing around bringing people back to the land and land rematriation, or other ways that you, both in the book and in your activism, the two of you explore these methodologies for that kind of systemic transformation.
So what we look at in the book is how inflammation is the response to damage and to damaged relationships. And as Raj described, when those relationships that support our wellness and our health are honored and respected with reciprocity, we live with less inflammation. And so if we have social structures that necessitate the devaluation of those relationships, whether it's the owning of private property, the treating of land as if it were a thing, the degradation of water, the pollution of our water, the decimation of our salmon populations, the cutting down of our forests. So the removing of relationships that support our entire wellness is at the core, the degradation of those relationships. So the opposite of that is reawakening those healthy relationships, re-enlivening those ways of relating that understand how we are completely dependent on a system of relationships for our health and wellness on a structural level. So it becomes impossible if you think about, if you want to have a healthy food system, we have to start examining the very roots of how it became unhealthy, how food and medicine were dissected from each other 600 years ago, in a time, where most traditional cultures around the world, all of them, food and medicine have been coextensive for as long as they've been together. And so how do we bring those things back together? It requires that we undo the structures that have ripped them apart. And so the work that we're doing with the Deep Medicine Circle, which is an organization that we started actually as we were writing the last chapter of this book. It's a woman of color-led organization that is working to heal the wounds of colonialism, that we understand that these things were separated through a mindset that came at the dawn of capitalism, these massive waves of colonizing the earth, where land and resources were stolen from other people, and where systems of supremacy really degraded the way that we interact with each other, the way we interact with our traditions, and the way we interact with the land. So how do we undo those things? And the work that we're doing on a farm that we are moving to return back into the hands of Ramaytush Ohlone people. It'll be their first landholding in this area in 200 years. There are only 4 surviving families of the genocide. And it's just a stone's throw away from where Portola landed and started his conquest of the San Francisco, what is now known as the San Francisco Peninsula. So what happens when we return the land to indigenous people and start to grow food and tend that land under their frameworks? And what that looks like for us is healing the land and healing the people. It means removing the food from the market economy, and starting to see those foods again as relatives, as entities that are there to support our health and whose health we are there to support. So that reciprocity is a core to the values of the indigenous people who lived here, and it seems to be universal throughout the world, which is probably why indigenous communities that are living with their systems of knowledge intact are stewarding the greatest biodiversity, not only around them, but also inside their gut. So that's, some of the work we're doing. We are growing food through agroecological means, also blending agroecology with indigenous traditional ecological knowledge. We have an amazing knowledge keeper, Sage Lappé, working with us. We are working with a Ramaytush elder, Kata Gomes, Greg Castro, on this beautiful farming project. And we see what happens to the health of the soil, the health of the water, the health of the people, the health of the indigenous people, the health of the people who eat the food, the health of the farmers, if we reframe farming as an act of healing, as an act of care, as an act of medicine, as opposed to, something that can move the market economy, and something that has to be on land that has been privatized and put into an exploitative dynamic. And so when you start to see how, when you shift that framework, you get, climate justice, racial justice, health justice, you get levels food justice, at all, you get all these bottom lines that you actually can't have when the structures are in place that necessitate the degradation of our relationships. So we are very excited about this project. We are also farming on a rooftop in Oakland, California, across the bay in the territory of Huichin, to do the same thing, just to liberate food from the market economy and to redefine how we're living in relationship to each other, in relationship to our foods.
Thanks, Rupa. And the last time I actually saw Rupa in person was on that rooftop farm that she's describing. And it was really incredible to see this rooftop transformed with agroecological food production in the middle of Oakland, California, where from the rooftop, we were there at night, you could see these huge boulevards with massive billboards advertising who knows what, and gas stations. And, it was very, very urban. And to see this incredible, thriving, agroecologically inspired farm was amazing. So again, if you have just joined us, or if you've been online with us this whole time, please put any questions you have for Rupa or Raj into the Q&A. I have a few more questions, and then we'll turn it over to questions that you all have. Again, we are talking about their incredible book, Inflamed. We'll put links in the chat if any of you want to find out where you can learn more about the book. And I want to turn it over to you, Raj, now. To give us another examples, or a few if you want, but of some really specific concrete examples of what is the counterpoint to what Rupa talked about at the top of the conversation about these toxic social structures that are really at the root of what we experience as individuals, as inflammation in our bodies? What are some counterpoints? Where are you seeing examples of a policy at work or an initiative at play, potentially at large scale, or even really at a small community level, where you feel like there's kind of the seeds being planted of what we might think of as a non-toxic social structure context? And Rupa, of course, just shared this incredible work she's doing with the Deep Medicine Circle that to me feels like a real embodiment of thinking about if what you call for in your book is a radical transformation of our relationships, the Deep Medicine Circle project to me is an embodiment of what that might look like. And I'd love for you to share with us some of what you've seen that you either talk about in the book or that you've seen in other reporting, or that you're working on in your community, that gives a window into what it might look like to have communities where you're actually in this web of relationship, as you and Rupa describe it.
Well, yeah, I mean, thanks so much for that invitation, Anna. I mean, the joy of this and of the sort of deep medicine that Rupa and I talk about in Inflamed is that at some level, it is very old as well as bleeding edge. So by very old, really what we're pointing to here is that the ideas around how it is that humans and the rest of the web of life are knit together are as old as the civilizations on Earth, barring capitalism. I mean, even capitalism has an idea about how humans and the web of life should exist together. And that idea is that humans should exploit the web of life because we can. Every other civilization has slightly more sophisticated ideas, which pay attention to things like consequence and dignity and life and suffering. There are lots of examples around the world where this idea of humans needing to reciprocate relationships, not just with one another, but with the web of life, are run very deep. So, in the book, we talk about Ubuntu, for example. We talk about the South African shack dwellers movement, Abahlali Basemjondolo, which is based out of Durban. It's the largest social movement, non-union social movement in South Africa. And these are people who live in shacks who are farming agroecologically, but also tending to one another, caring for one another and for the world around them, in resistance to the ways that capitalism and the ANC and the sort of forces of violence around them are conspiring to change them and transform them. And that sort of interface between community care for one another and the predations of capitalism can be found almost everywhere. I mean, since we're at a farming conference, it would be remiss not to point out that in addition to the fantastic session that's I believe coming up on the Indian farmers movement, the resistance that's happening around the sort of commodification and the transformation of the food system in India is really important to look at. One of our favorite chapters in Inflamed is about the inflammation not of our guts but of our lungs. Well, and other parts of our body as well. In Inflamed, we point out that a lot of inflammation has a fair amount to do with fire. The pitch for this book is that your planet, your community, and your body are inflamed. One of the stories that we tell in Inflamed is about how everyone should be aware that India is, particularly urban India, is the site of some of the most extreme air pollution on the planet. And this happens in part because of the Green Revolution. The Green Revolution, as many will know, is this sort of intervention to squeeze out sustainable patterns of farming and biodiversity, and instead you sort of concentrate on two kinds of crop monocultures, of wheat and of rice. Because of the ways that the planting season has worked, and because of the vast over irrigation of the Indian farmland, the Indian government has introduced restrictions on the amount of irrigation that's possible. And so as farmers transition from one crop to another, they find that there's not enough time to pull out plants by hand, and so they have to burn at the change of the seasons in November to clear the crop stubble and to begin the planting for the next season. And that burning in its turn will create vast amounts of pollution that drifts from the wheat belt in Punjab all the way down to Delhi and elsewhere in India. Now, what's been exciting in the farmers' movement protests is not just that farmers have been fighting against the arrival of the sort of vast industrialists and capitalists interested in yet further impoverishing Indian farmers, but also that in the sites of struggle, right there on the protests, there are libraries, there are seed libraries, there are book libraries, there are exchanges where people are not just sharing ideas about how it is that they can plant more sustainably, but also exploring ideas about, well, look, if we don't like the Green Revolution and we definitely don't like what Narendra Modi is offering us next, what are the policies that we would like to have? And those spaces of protest, and I'm very excited that Rupa will be able to talk to us a little bit about her experience at Standing Rock, but these spaces of protests are themselves zones where it's possible to experience what it is to live in a world where food might be free, where care might be distributed fairly, where everyone cares for one another, and we are united in moments of realizing our own dignity in opposition to the predations of capitalism. So those are just two examples, Anna. One from South Africa of how abahlali basemjondolo, particularly in the pandemic, has been able to feed some of the poorest people in urban South Africa through these webs of care, but also in India, in the protest front lines around Delhi, while covered with the sort of smoke and smog and residue of the Green Revolution's consequences in India, some of the most interesting ideas about what comes next are being hatched in the front lines from farmers who are forming these really vibrant intellectual communities that are learning and sharing ideas between themselves, and learning from seed, and learning from their environment, and learning from the context, and learning from resistance. I think that's actually what it is to experience an anti-inflammatory moment. It's not the inflammation goes away. In fact, they're surrounded by the causes of inflammation every day. But the sort of moment of anti-inflammatory activism is precisely that, where we knit care together again, and we take time as organic intellectuals to imagine what it might be to live in a world beyond this sort of capitalist colonialist state.
Thanks so much, Raj. And I want to turn it over to you, Rupa, now. Raj mentioned the work that you did in Standing Rock, and I think that's a great segue to talk about that concrete work that you did there and how that ties into what Raj was talking about. I also just want to share, Raj, someone mentioned, I think Stephen dropped into the chat, the link to the article that you wrote about the Green Revolution. And I feel like it's required reading for anyone who wants to understand more deeply how we are where we are in our global food system, particularly as we see global philanthropists continue to push this model of a green revolution around the world with initiatives like the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, articles like the one that Raj wrote, and that I'll drop it again in the chat so everybody can be sure to see it. It's just really, really essential reading. So I want to turn it over to you, Rupa. I thought you might want to share a little bit about your work in Standing Rock. And as folks have said in the chat, feel free to use the Q&A to drop in some more questions. I've got another question or two for this first half of our time together, and then we'll be bringing in your voices and questions. So Rupa, did you want to talk about your work in Standing Rock and how that's an example of building these deeper webs of relationships and kind of creating this community response to inflammation?
Yeah, so what's been exciting about writing this book and working with Raj on it is actually seeing how many fertile, incredible spaces of building the new world is happening right now, building new systems, old systems, bringing back ideas that have been sequestered or snuffed out by colonial capitalism. These imaginings in Lakota community, Dakota Nakota territory, where I was called by California Indigenous people to come help with the medical response as the police and the hired mercenaries were becoming increasingly violent towards the Indigenous people who were opposing the Dakota Access Pipeline going through their sacred river, through Minnesota, or what's known as the Missouri River. And so that medical response turned into a whole network of largely Indigenous women coming together to insist upon creating a new system of health for their communities. So the Lakota people have some of the worst health indices of the Western Hemisphere, second only to Haiti. And Haiti was, the first successful slave rebellion in this hemisphere. And the Lakota were some of the fiercest resistors of Western colonization, and now consequently have the worst, health outcomes. And that's not just a mistake; it's structural. It's on purpose. And so these young women and old women have gotten together and are wanting to build their own health systems. And I was just there for a strategic meeting with the community, and it's not simply like, let's get a clinic and get people more insulin. It's let's create the structures in our land that bring back our coming of age ceremonies, that bring back how we're supposed to be born, how we're supposed to die, how we're supposed to relate to the water and the land, how we're supposed to tend the trees and the buffalo. Let's bring back the buffalo. The greatest genocide in the history of mammalian culture has been the genocide of the buffalo throughout, the plains here. So we lost this incredible system and pulsation of soil and grass, and this disturbance regime that the Oceti-Sakowin, the people of the plains, knew how to manage, and managed very well for thousands and thousands of years. And within 250 years, it's become, a dust bowl. It's become, the soil is depleted. That we have to pump in all of these fossil fuel-based inputs to just eke out, this monocropping nightmare, which is destroying the biodiversity of the landscape, as well as the health of the water. The largest aquifer in North America is under that land. And there's some evidence now that shows that aquifer was planted there. That water was planted by the movement of the buffalo and the people and the grasses. And so to bring back those sophisticated understandings is what health is about. And these women recognize that to form a clinic is not enough. It has to be nation building. It has to be redesigning structures for housing and for energy and for food that are outside of the capitalist mentality that say no, thank you to the colonial framework, and to start building that. And that's what they're doing with the Mini Michoni Health Circle. You should check them out. I can drop a link in the chat. Just incredible visionary work. And it's happening right now. And so that's what gives me a lot of hope, is that as we do talk about inflammation and understand that we are inflamed because these critical systems of relationship have been damaged, and they're damaged on a daily level. So people who are more exposed to that damage have a greater burden of that damage. People who are confronting structural racism, class dynamics, burdened by debt. Those things add up to a greater burden of inflammatory disease. So there is disparity here that needs to be addressed. But all of us are impacted by it. You can't escape it when the air is being polluted. You can't escape it when these poisons are in our food system. And so how do we create alternatives and show better ways of doing things? And that is happening right now, from the global south, from India to the shack dwellers movement, to the Oceti-Sakowin, to what's happening here in Ohlone territory. There's beautiful work happening all over the world, and it's being led by Black, Brown, and Indigenous people around the world, saying, we're done. 600 years is enough of poisoning the earth and poisoning the people. Let's build better ways together.
Thanks so much, Rupa. I'm so enjoying hearing both you and Raj this morning here. I have a question for you, Raj, and then a final one for you, Rupa, and then I want to bring in some of these great questions we're hearing from those of you tuning in. Again, please drop any questions you want into the Q&A. So Raj, as Rupa was talking, she talked about debt and the way in which actually debt, this connection between debt and inflammation. And I know when I've heard you both talk about your book at other events, you've given this really powerful, what I have found is a really powerful example of debt and inflammation, which some people might not connect those dots. And I'd love for you to speak to it, because I think it helped me, I will say, kind of expand my notion of the ways in which our bodies are impacted by, again, what you and Rupa talk about as these toxic social structures, and ways that we typically don't hear people talking about. We typically don't hear those dots connected. So I'd love if you want to speak to that example that you share in the book, and you've shared in other presentations about this work, and then I'll turn it over to a question to you, Rupa.
Well, and thank you, Anna. I mean, the key idea here is something that Rupa mentioned earlier on, right? Inflammation is your body's response to damage, or the threat of damage. And this is why language and why social forces are so tremendously important. Because if you feel threatened, your body will move into an inflammatory state in anticipation of damage that may be coming. And the way that your body knows that things are coming is because your mind is attuned to danger all around you. So what happens when that danger is that your home is repossessed? What happens when that danger is that your car gets towed away because you haven't kept up with payments on it, and therefore you will lose your job? those kinds of threats of damage are very real. And that's why, that's why debt is such an important vector, because in order to avoid your car being towed away, you will maybe go find something like a payday loan. A payday loan of $300 can result in a final payment of something like $800, so an APR of 400%. And those kinds of loans are associated with far higher levels of blood pressure, of inflammatory markers. And I think that what's important to understand is that if we were to abolish payday loans, then we would see precipitous declines in the rates of suicide and of drug abuse, because the stress that comes along with having high levels of debt that particularly are being faced by the working poor around the world are measured out and are played out. The consequences of these debts are played out at a cellular level. And so it's important then to understand that actually, if you do want to reduce suicide rates in a society, and if you do want to reduce levels of accidental drug overdose, then as a public health measure, banning payday loans is a no regrets policy. So that, I think, is at the individual level one way of understanding how debt is deeply coercive for individual bodies. And then think about how it is that debt from the global north to the global south is also used to keep the global south farming in particular ways. Again, returning to the fact that we are at a farming conference, it is important to ask, well, why are large parts of the global south commissioned to grow tropical products for the global north, or to provide coffee and tea and bananas and everything that the global north now can't live without? It's because of histories of debt, in which after decolonization, of the formal act of countries from the global north handing over the keys to elites in the global south, the sort of chains of fiscal dependency were nonetheless never broken, and in fact were strengthened. There were moments in the 20th century where the continent of Africa was able to be self-sufficient in food production, and because of the imposition of debt through organizations like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, the continent was transformed into an engine of commodity production for the global north, and is now not able to be able to feed itself without imports. And again, the demands of that kind of farming, system in which farmers are essentially vassals for rich landowners who then extract maximum yields from the land while degrading the soil and degrading the life of the workers on that soil. That's certainly a feature of indebtedness at a country level in the global south. But again, you don't have to travel very far to see that. As we mentioned in our talk last year, the largest farmer in the United States, the largest owner of farmland in the United States, is Bill Gates. And again, the mechanisms through which he is able to extract value and extract return from his investments in farmland here is precisely the same kinds of mechanisms of debt, where farmers don't own the land that they work on, and in which indebted farmers find themselves in these cycles of needing to borrow more and more money, lose the land to Bill Gates, and find themselves then as tenants working to be able to extract the maximum yield return from the land, to be able to pay to pay the rent, so that Bill Gates can continue to get his yield from from his investment. So again, the sort of cycles of debt and of capitalist appropriation are certainly written into ourselves, but they're written into the fabric of society, and yet that's the investment, the returns for which allow Bill Gates to be the sort of prophet of vaccines, and to appear to be the good guy in the middle of this pandemic, when, as we discussed last year, he's anything but.
Thanks, Raj. So I want to turn it over in a minute to questions from all of you. And I love all the questions that you shared and look forward to raising them with Raj and Rupa. But I'd love, Rupa, for you to come in. And I know this is a huge question, as all of our questions are. So I know that in a few minutes, you can't fully do the question justice, but I feel like as we enter into this year with the pandemic continuing to rage all around us, knowing we are speaking to you in a hospital, where after this you'll be going back to help patients who have been impacted by COVID, I felt like it would be remiss for us not to contextualize this conversation in this particular moment in global history. And I know you've talked with me about how much you're seeing the kind of framework that you all have raised in the book play out in this response to the pandemic, and how you've talked about, from your perspective, you see efforts like really trying to support non-patented vaccines and mass vaccination as a form of mutual aid, as a form of reknitting these webs of relationships. And I just wondered, how you're making sense of this ongoing pandemic and our failure to respond well to it as a global community, and certainly as a country in the United States, and how that connects to these themes of inflammation, these themes you talk about in the book. And then I'll pull some questions in from those of you tuning in next.
Yes, well, it's heartbreaking to see my Indian colleagues struggling to get one dose of a vaccine that works to prevent severe illness while I'm being ordered to get 3. It's really morally, ethically, very deeply distressing. So the lack of, we have an effective Pfizer, Moderna, we have 2 effective vaccines that really keep people out of the hospital. While we are seeing breakthrough infections, right now, we haven't seen the rise in breakthrough infections lead to the rise of hospitalizations of people. I don't think that is a forever statement. Everything about this virus changes, and we have to be nimble in our response and our thinking. But absolutely, the atomization of the world of humanity is part of the colonial capitalist cosmology, that we could be separate from each other, that we actually don't have obligations and duties and responsibilities to one another, because you can't actually run a capitalist economy if you really felt like you had those duties and obligations. And that's what we saw here when, the CDC just shortened, the Center for Disease Control shortened our quarantine time to 5 days after the Delta CEO was like, oh my God, our flights, we don't have any flights, we don't have any workers, let's get them all back to work. So you're really seeing the violence towards the working class right now, the cattle prodding of putting people back to work so that the machine, the engine, can keep running. And that's not just the engine to, move goods and services to the global south. That's, to keep the flow of capital moving so that the elite, the 1%, can continue to make their profits. And that, at the expense of the health and wellness of working class people. Who are disproportionately Black, brown, and poor white folks. And so as I sit here in the hospital and just, yesterday saw a 70-year-old woman who hasn't gotten out of bed since she survived COVID in November of 2020, still can't breathe, still can't leave her bed, is in constant pain. We think about, the death rate isn't so bad, but you're seeing this huge amount of disability. And I fear it's going to get worse. And we don't have structures or systems to take care of those people. We don't have the way that our society is organized right now, that money is extracted from the healthcare system into the pockets of the executives and the administrators. And what we need is that those resources there to take care of the patients, to take care of people who will be sick for a long time with this. But I see the dysfunction, the extraction and dysfunction of the healthcare system as being the same kind of extraction and dysfunction as the food system. And that's why, we call for decolonizing these systems and creating different structures that will leave the value inside the system to care, to prioritize care. And so, yes, we do need to be offering these vaccines to all people on planet Earth who want them. And I know that there's lots of people in the global south who would love to have them. And it's criminal to have patents and corporations making record profits as so many people are confronting disease and death. And so that has been a very, very challenging experience, but not just the dynamic between the global south and the global north. It's also watching what's happening here in my own hospital and around San Francisco and in the Bay Area as we confront record Omicron cases. We're not nimble enough to see how our thinking and adaptations must change. So, there's this binary dynamic that happens, like either kids are in school or they're out of school and they're lonely and depressed and suicidal. It's like, well, why can't we have outdoor education? We live in one of the most beautiful places in the world. It'd be a great time to have a climate education year for all school-age children around the world. Like, let's get our kids to fall in love with the earth and learn about taking care of the earth and learn about taking care of each other, and what that looks like and means. They don't have to be isolated and alone to do it, but they can be outside, and that would mitigate the spread of disease. And so let's be nimble, let's be imaginative, and let's prioritize care. And that's not what we're seeing happening. We're seeing the prioritization of the economy. But the economy requires workers who are healthy, and the workers deserve to be healthy, have the opportunity to be healthy, and that will not be possible until we change these structures.
Thanks, Rupa. So we are going to now bring questions in from all of you and have a conversation for the rest of our time together. And I thought I would start getting great questions and a lot of love for both of you and the book. And I thought I would start with a question from Samantha. Kind of picks up a little bit on where you were heading, Rupa, talking about like, how do we reimagine our communities? And so Samantha wrote this question. Community gardens won't address the problems in the food chain, but from what you've shared so far, I can see how they could be pivotal in reinstating some of the relationships so crucial to well-being. As someone establishing their first community garden in a small but very multicultural village in southern Spain, are there insights from your research that you could share that might enrich our project? So maybe start with either one of you to weigh in here.
I can share a couple of things from work in Detroit that I've been lucky enough to be on the peripheries of. And in Detroit, there's a group called Cook, Eat, Talk. And what they do is get together, have meals, they cook them, and then they eat them together, and then they talk. So it's an incredibly well-named organization, and the great joy of it is that the kitchen table becomes the space for these sort of very neighborhood, sort of block level discussions around social policy, around personal care, about what it is that just folk on the block are going through. And that can be incredibly important because having both, recognizing that the work of care and the work of tending is the work of actually sort of building these connections. Is a great way of sort of kickstarting movements. So here in Austin, the Multicultural Refugee Coalition, for instance, has spaces that are precisely these community gardens that are zones not to be able to feed people, because you can't possibly grow enough food on the sort of small patches of land in order to be able to feed entire refugee communities. But what you can do is build the social relationships that are required. And now, I wanted to recognize and appreciate the question that you're right, these gardens can't solve the problems, particularly because they are they're too small, and often they're not in areas that can ordinarily flourish. One of the things we point out in the book is that even thinking about the abstract space of urban geography in America, there are temperature differences between rich neighborhoods and poor neighborhoods, white neighborhoods and black neighborhoods, and that matters if you're trying to grow stuff. And there is a 7 degrees Celsius difference between a white neighborhood and a black neighborhood, which is something that the data for which we cite in the book. Then you're looking at different sort of agroecological systems. You're looking at soil that is far more polluted in areas where people of color live than in sort of the posh white areas. So I want to thank you for the question and suggest that while these zones of engagement are precisely what it is that we need to be able to build these community connections, those community connections have to exceed the space of the garden and of the table. They have to, to be pointed outwards. But the great joy of food is its sensuality, its conviviality, the fact that you can love and care and tend through it in ways that are radically democratizing and beautiful. And that kind of rocket fuel, when you're, when you're all around the table together, or when you're just in the garden together, can be incredibly potent for making the kind of systemic change that we need.
That's one of the things we do talk about in the book, is the importance of cultivating our imaginations that have been put to sleep, anesthetized on purpose. And those spaces of encounter are critical for that. So I would say, just engage as many people in the community as you can to participate and to have a chance to build it with you. Because that intersection, those spaces of intersection and encounter, are the fertile space, which is, why in the US we actually don't have any public gathering spaces like that. We don't really have the Piazza Grande. We don't have these places where people are sharing in common. Because when we do share in common, it becomes a direct threat and challenge to a system that requires that everyone has private property and it's either mine or yours. And when we start to engage in these other kind of spaces, it allows our imaginings to become awakened. And that is a very important part of this work.
Yeah, and as you both were talking, I was thinking about how the power of food and taste is part of reigniting our imaginations and connecting ourselves to our histories and our past. And in both the projects I know you are working with immigrant communities, refugee communities, indigenous communities, and so much of the work is a question of, then what shall we plant? What seeds shall we save? What taste shall we actually bring back? And that, Samantha, with the work you're doing in Southern Spain, thinking about, it might not, while these community gardens, as Raj said, might not create a quantity of food to feed huge swaths of a population where you're working, the qualities of the foods and the diversity of the foods and the flavors and the potential to reignite memories through taste is you hold that power. And that's an exploration you can do in the community of what are those foods maybe that have been lost or that you can carry forward. So just to add that as well. So I want to bring in this question. It's kind of a big pivot to go from really talking about community gardens, a big pivot, but connects to kind of another strand of your work. So Stephen asked this question. Inflammation and ill health is a growing problem, right? The Green Revolution is still lauded, still encroaching on our rights and our landscapes. How do we turn this around? The new GMO arms race, and maybe you could each talk about what you think he means by that. I have some ideas, but the new GMO arms race is clearly more of the same, more ways to support extractive capitalism. What alternatives are available? What mechanisms can we look to make a stand against the myopic messaging and fraudulent claiming of future proofing of global food security?
Raj, you should run with this one.
And not just me, by the way, for folk listening in, Anna Lappé is a legendary activist and thinker on these issues. And I'm so pleased, Anna, that you shared some of your experience with these community gardens before. And I'd love for you to pitch in here if you might. But again, thank you so much for the question. I think part of the issue here is that we need to, that we are locked in to thinking around the food system that is, centuries old, right? That this is the sort of productivist mindset that Thomas Malthus who squats in our brain every time we think about population. Whenever you hear the word population and food supply, there's someone doing some thinking for you, and that someone is the world's first paid economist, Thomas Malthus. He was paid by the colonial British East India Company as their economist in chief. And basically, the idea that Malthus has is, look, population grows exponentially, but food supply only grows arithmetically. And at some point, we're going to run out of food, and then all hell breaks loose. And at that moment, steps in Cargill, Nestle, what have you, saying, look, what we need is the right kind of technology here in order to be able to wring more out of the earth. And we're going to set the metrics so that metrics we count are only the ones that favor our way of accounting. And so we're not going to pay any attention to this biodiversity stuff or pollution or the changing climate. We're just going to focus on yield and wringing the as much possible out of the ground for just one crop. And we're going to ignore all the other things that go into an agroecological system. Now, the consequence of that, of course, is that you find yourself on a treadmill of then needing to hit that number year after year after year. And as the effectiveness of pesticides and fertilizers go down, the crops need to be engineered yet more and more and more. And that's as I understand it, Stephen, and thanks again for the question, is what you're referring to with this GMO arms race, that we're trying to magically tweak the genetics of particular crops in order to be able to keep up with the impossible demand that one crop planted in rows of that crop and nothing else continues to give more and more out of the land, which at some point the soil just becomes this sort of dust. The aquifers beneath that soil become empty, and the people working on the soil become cancer-ridden. Now, that's the problem is that when we're locked into these narratives of, look, there's only one way of doing it. How are you ever going to grow food with your organic methods? You can never compete with the amount of yield we have, and there's going to be 9 billion people on Earth. How on earth are you going to feed them all? And what do you want to pay everyone to be paying $10 for a hamburger? And these kinds of narratives are ones that are at some level, of course, important to take seriously, because hunger and poverty are real, but poverty is itself a product of the food system. And to recognize that 7 out of the 10 worst paying jobs in America are in the food system gives you a sense of how you push back against this kind of a narrative. Instead of saying, look, cheap food for everyone, the point is good wages and good health and good livelihood for everyone. And that means a return to biodiversity, a breaking from the kinds of narratives and the political ecology of the industrial food system. But that gets back to the message of Inflamed, and gets back to the work that's happening on the Mother Dill farm with the deep medicine circles. I'm going to throw it back to you, Rupa, because nothing tells the story of breaking away from the GMO arms race like doing it.
Yeah, I think that kind of pushing back on the naysayers, even in the urban and peri-urban agroecology work that we're doing, has been really interesting. People who consider themselves, in the health and farming world will say, oh, you can't get rid of glyphosate. We actually need that to grow this much food. You can't get rid of these industrial processes. But in fact, small to medium farmers are doing a huge lift feeding the world already. And if we can feed the world without damaging the planet, that's the goal here. Not only not damaging the planet, but not damaging our bodies, like you're saying, Raj, with these, cancer-ridden bodies. And as I've worked here at UCSF for the last 20 years, we're seeing more and more people come in with colon cancers that are highly aggressive at 30 years old. It's heartbreaking to watch 30-year-old people die of these diseases. And it's not like we just have a wave of genetic abnormalities. We have to start looking outside at the environments that people are being exposed to in their guts, in their bodies, and where those toxins are coming from that are harming our children. And so it is exciting to see how much food can be grown in these environments, and how by staying small and scaling up. So you don't need to have, giant monocropping of 1 million almond trees to feed the world almonds and use up all the water in California. Instead, you could have millions of small to medium farms that are run by and owned by and different kinds of people participating in the food system, so that you develop a food system that is also diverse. Anna, going back to what you're saying, so as we are bringing indigenous communities and different people back to the land to grow food, there's trauma there as people grow their seeds, their ancestral seeds. There's an opportunity to heal that from that trauma, to say, oh my God, we haven't had these seeds in so long. Or I remember when my grandmother would talk about, doing this with this food, or we prepared it this way. So there's this whole awakening happening right now that is tremendous, because it's not simply about growing food. It is about reawakening our ancestral relationships to who we are, who we've been, and who we are here. Me as a Punjabi person born and raised on stolen land, what is my duty and responsibility on this land to be a good guest and to participate in ways that both honor my ancestors and the righteous work my Sikh relatives have done in advocating for justice? How do I translate that here on this land?
Beautiful. Yeah, I'll never forget many years ago, as I was doing reporting with my mother, Frances Moore Lappé, in southern Kenya with Wangari Maathai, the incredible founder of the Greenbelt movement in Kenya, who went on to be honored with the Nobel Peace Prize. She was part of creating this incredible women-led movement to not just replant trees, but to reignite indigenous foods and create community kitchens and home gardens for folks across villages across Kenya. And I remember sitting with a village elder in her home who was serving us some foods that she had grown in this kitchen garden, organized by, inspired by the Greenbelt movement. And she was in her 70s at the time, and she shared with us what that experience was like for her the first time she tasted the traditional grains, the millets and the sorghum that her community had been told not to grow anymore through the kinds of policies that Raj referred to earlier through World Bank and IMF structural adjustments programs. There had been this, push across the continent toward export-oriented production, to growing commodities and grow coffee to sell on the market. Don't grow for yourself. Don't grow food you actually eat. And she shared with us that the first time she tasted these cereals again, she wept. I mean, it was like she had this visceral reaction. It was joy. It was also trauma of that she had not tasted those foods since she was a child. And as she was telling us the story, she said to my mother and me, she said, you have to go back to your people and tell them that we Kikuyu, we almost lost our traditional food cultures, but we're getting them back. And it's that sense of that ability to really reconnect with that indigenous history through food and the power of that and through health. So I want to turn now to lots of great questions. I want to turn now to this interesting question that came in about media and communications and how you're hearing these stories told about inflammation. And Raj, you mentioned at the top of the conversation about how, we're sort of sold on these anti-inflammatory diets. And I remember the last time I went to one of our mainstream food expos in the United States before COVID, when they used to do these things. I went into the expo hall and I felt like almost every other stand was selling some kind of turmeric infused something, turmeric tea, turmeric chews, turmeric smoothies, turmeric everything. And it was all billed as anti-inflammatory, right? And so this question comes in. I'd like to ask Rupa and Raj their thoughts on this role of mainstream media in inflammation, both this kind of language and sensationalism, how it's very reductionist when it comes to our health and diets, how it can be so focused on individual practices, and how you all are trying to shift that, how we might collectively, we have 300 people on the line right now, and many more who will watch the recording of this. How can we be part of changing how this story is told? As you bring in this helpful framework around inflammation, but how do we make sure that we don't inadvertently kind of layer on to this, okay, we're all going to get off this Zoom and go buy, turmeric tea at the store? Not that I'm against turmeric tea. I probably have some in my kitchen, but that it's bigger than that, of course, right? So curious, what role you see the media playing, and how those of us in these movements around the world can be part of shifting the conversation.
Well, I can give you an example here at UCSF where we have on our dashboard of our health system, these people got together and said, let's put a structural determinants of health dashboard so that we can see, how the structural determinants of health are impacting our patient population in the hospital. And I was like, that's awesome. Let's see what, trying to shape and guide them, and how are they going to do this? And what they came up with was, a little image of smoking, a little image of a wine glass, a little image of, some dollar signs. Like, does this person engage in these behaviors as an individual that will lead to their poor health? That is not a structural determinant of health. That, the question is, are they smoking the cigarettes because they are trying to lessen their anxiety from the police who are patrolling their neighborhoods, and they are Black and they're afraid of getting shot by the police who are terrorizing their neighborhoods? That's the structural level. That's the determinants of health are about power and lines of power. And so if we keep this dialogue about inflammation as your own personal choices and what little thing you're going to eat and how you're going to take your probiotic pills, we're missing the point about why we are inflamed. We are inflamed because the lines of power have been structured in such a way that it is impossible to avoid inflammation. We will all be inflamed with the way our society is structured. So if we want to have different outcomes, we must change the structures. And that is the big takeaway, point, is that the media will always obsess on focusing on the individual, and we consider it a form of medical gaslighting. That, the problem is not in the individual. The problem, if you have obesity, it's not because you just lack the willpower to make good choices. It's because you were never afforded the opportunity of real choices that would make you healthy. You were never afforded the opportunity of a real lifestyle that wouldn't cripple you. And that's really, for me, the biggest take home is that if we want a healthy population, if we want the right to be healthy, if we want the ability to have wellness, we have to stop framing it as our individual choices. And, I saw another question that someone asked about, is your book about how I can address my inflammation or something different? And yes, there's stuff in our book that people could take home and go, oh, okay, if I'm eating, or if I'm exposing myself to these toxins, or if I'm exposed to these toxins, it's going to impact my health. Yes. But this book is more than that. This is about, if we want to make sure we even have the opportunity to avoid these diseases and to have lower inflammation, we have to get involved in collectively organizing and transforming these systems. So it has taken 600 years to get here, where inflammatory disease is the #1 killer of human beings on planet Earth, especially all those places that have been structured through colonial capitalism, through colonial mindsets. So how long will it take for us to restructure it? This is not just work for ourselves. This is work for our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren. This is giving them the gift of the possibility of health in the future to come. And it's critical that we engage this work now, because this rising tide of inflammatory disease will not change until we start doing that. And this is not an easy lift. It's not a quick lift. It's not a quick fix, but it's absolutely essential that we all get down, roll up our sleeves and do it. And the good news is that all the structures that we must change to lower the inflammation in our bodies will also lower the inflammation on our planet.
I mean, to pick that up and think about the media side of that, because there's the way that colonial capitalism has been able to normalize itself is through representations of supremacies of one kind or another through different kinds of media. And in the 20th and 21st century, those kinds of media were the sort of mass media that we now can invite into our brains to live rent-free through our phones. But that kind of representation and the kinds of representation that normalize certain kinds of supremacy are vital in supporting and maintaining systems of domination. One of the ideas that we talk about in the book is white supremacy, and the role of medicine in white supremacy is a little more intimate than you would think. You might think of there's the evil food system that you know all about. So there's a lovely question here about what's the point of this talk? We already know this. So you already know then that the system is the way it is. But then, you might think, well, but over here are the medics. They're the nice people. They come and they mop your brow after this evil food system and its domination have worked its wicked way on your body. And it's the medics who are the good guys who come in and sort of, take care of you after the bad things have been done to you by Monsanto. And of course, that's not the case. Medicine and colonial domination have always gone hand in hand, along with the food system. And one of the facts that we have in the book is about how white supremacy exists even in the medical industry. And there's a particularly appalling fact for those of us living in what are now called the United States, where in 2016, 58% of the white population in the United States thought that black skin was thicker than white skin, and therefore that black folk don't feel pain the same that white folk do. And of course, this is entirely incorrect, but it's a myth that is perpetuated through certain kinds of representations in the mainstream media. But here's the weird thing. 40% of first-year white medical students also believed this. And after 4 years of medical school, 20% of white medical students still believed this. So if we're talking about the role of mainstream media, don't think of the role of mainstream media as just the people who are advertising you dodgy food. The mainstream media is there as part of a system of domination that encourages us to forget certain kinds of relationships, to encourage us to think about certain kinds of supremacy as normal, and eliminates the sort of cognitive space for us to imagine things differently. And so, this is in part to sort of hate on mainstream media and on social media, but also to suggest that if we are going to use these tools, we need to use them carefully and subversively, because they are created and constructed as a way of dominating us.
Great. Well, that's a great segue to another question that's come in that I wanted to raise. And Rupa, we'll turn it to you first, and Raj, of course, if you want to add anything. But it gets to kind of this question around how to engage medics or the medical system, healthcare practitioners. And again, if we were in a room together with you, hundreds of people, we could have, by a show of hands, how many of you work in the healthcare system? We can't do that here virtually so easily, but maybe some of you do. Of course, we all interact with the healthcare system. And so I'm just curious, Rupa, if you want to talk about, this question was asking, how do you talk to medical professionals and raise these issues of more broader systemic questions of inflammation, how we as all of us who interact with the medical system might engage with our doctors differently or talk to them differently, kind of prompt them to ask us different questions. And, are you seeing movement afoot in medical schools? That was a staggering and appalling statistic, Raj, about how medical schools do not do the work they need to do and should be doing to address entrenched ideas of white supremacy. Are you seeing movement afoot to bring some of these more systemic understandings of health into medical schools, and how our future doctors learn about these issues? I was talking with a colleague who's a doctor, and she was saying, it's something like, you would know this, Rupa, like, less than half a dozen hours spent on nutrition to become a certified doctor. So if you want to just talk about this question, Rupa, and Raj, feel free to weigh in. We've got about 10 more minutes together. And so Rupa, dive in, and then I'll pull up a couple more questions to ask. Thanks.
So one of the great things about having written this book is we can now hand it to our colleagues, which is awesome. And I will say it is the medical students who are running with this book. And it is now being offered at several medical schools and brought into sociology classes at universities. So I think the younger generation is hungry for this understanding, because they see its connection not only between bodies, but also between the earth and the systems, the climate systems that we touch upon in the book. Here at UCSF, we've had an interesting insurrection of our medical students because, as I mentioned, that structural determinant, like that picture of the smoking, no smoking and glass of wine, because the way I call it the liberal analysis of structural determinants of health, where it's like, okay, we feel good, we can name them. Look, this person's drinking too much, or this person doesn't have a car, poor thing, they can't make it to their appointment. Maybe we should get them a taxi voucher. So it's very much about naming things like this close to the problem as opposed to looking here. So the people who are teaching that class at UCSF, there was just a couple months ago, literally the med students took over the class on Zoom and held the teachers hostage and taught the teachers. And they were Black medical students saying, like, the way you're teaching this actually makes it seem like these things are inevitable. Because if you're not teaching it from a transformational practice, you're basically saying everyone's doomed to just live these poor health outcomes. And that's the problem with the liberal analysis, not just in medicine, but in food and in climate, is that it's about, okay, let's just name the problem, but not really get at the structures that brought us here and reimagine them. And so we're seeing medical students coming in demanding a deeper transformational understanding of how to improve health. And so that's been wonderful to be able to offer those students this. One of the organizations I'm part of, the Do No Harm Coalition, is starting a political education series actually this month, which will be posted online, because those medical students are like, we don't see the kind of education we want in medical school. Let's go interview, Tiny Gray Garcia, who is she's formerly unhoused, she's building housing solutions for people in Oakland with, formerly unhoused people, getting them into their own housing, poor people-led solutions to poverty in Oakland. Let's interview Karina Gould, our Ohlone elder here in, Chochenyo territory in the villages of Lishan. Let's interview Kat Brooks, who's been leading the anti-police terror project in Oakland. Let's interview the people who are actually looking at the structures that are causing poor health and understand from them in the community how we advance health agendas. That's what they want to hear. They're not stupid. But it's interesting because you see people who are in power and empowered by this structure, very resistant to opening their minds to this narrative and understanding, very recalcitrant. And that's the job we have to do, is just keep pushing from the bottom. And that's what the students are doing. And it's been inspiring.
Great. Thanks, Rupa. I'm going to turn to you, Raj, with one final big picture question, and then we'll give the last word to a question, a kind of rapid fire question from Marya. But Raj, a question came in, and I know you have studied the sugar industry and the history of sugar, and there's a great, if I can quickly find it, there's a great podcast that you did for a podcast that Raj hosts with a local station in Austin, Texas, that I will drop into the chat on sugar, history of sugar. The question came in, curious to know if Rupa and Raj have found a connection between sugar and inflammation and food allergies. The sugar industry is very strong. Sugar is one of the primary foods we eat in many different forms. And so I just thought I'd lob it over to you, Raj, if you to talk about this connection between sugar, history of sugar, inflammation.
Well, very quickly, yes, we did, and it's unsurprising that in our discussion of endocrine disruptors, which is in itself a fascinating discussion, we were looking at endocrine disrupting chemicals and looking at the chemical industry in Europe, and the way that the chemical industry in Europe said that they shouldn't be regulated is that, yes, all right, their chemicals do in fact disrupt the endocrine system, but the biggest endocrine disruptor is the sugar industry, and you're not regulating them, so why should you regulate us? And that is, of course, just a bonkers fallacy, because obviously both need to be regulated. The sugar and the sugar industry is an immensely powerful force for evil and for human harm. And if you'd like to know a little bit more about that, then the podcast, Anna, that you were talking about was with the legendary anthropologist Sidney Mintz, whose book Sweetness and Power is both one of the most readable sort of histories of sugar, but also one of the most profoundly moving and insightful, and just kudos to the late Sydney Mintz. And if you'd like to know about that, yes, The Secret Ingredient is the name of the podcast. But there's a lot more about that in Inflamed, particularly in the endocrine disruption chapter.
Great, thanks, Raj. So in our last few minutes, I loved this question that Marya put into the Q&A, and apologies, of course, as these conversations always go, we didn't have a chance to get to all of your questions, but the chat will be shared with Rupa and Raj, and so will the questions, and I'll drop some links into the chat for ways that you can learn more about Rupa and Raj's work. So Marya asked this question, and we'll start with you, Rupa, and then turn it over to Raj. If you could both wish for 3 things each to change the systemic dynamics that cause inflammation, what would they be? So if you could wave your agroecological magic wands and sprinkle nutrient-dense fairy dust out there, what would be those 3 things? And again, we'll start with you, Rupa.
I think the first thing I would do, and this is coming from occupied and unceded Turtle Island, I would give all the land back to Indigenous people and live under their sovereignty and under their perspectives as a guest. I would make it impossible for sociopathic corporations to exist, and keep the wealth in the hands of the people. And I would empower systems where people who work are benefiting directly from their labor. For a third one, I guess I would prioritize care in the structure of an economy above and beyond everything. And I don't know if that's, detailed enough for you, but that's, if I can see it in my mind's eye, I can see it. But I think it starts with giving the land back and repairing those historic harms. And if you're in England, I think that means getting the commons back and getting the women back into positions of power where they belonged as the keepers of the commons.
Love it. Raj?
I mean, to draw from the conclusion of the book, I think it's decolonize, decolonize, decolonize. But what that means is move towards an economy of care and repair. If the care that Rupa mentioned is a care not just for other human beings, but for the entire web of life. And repair is not merely to sort of mend what it is that has been broken, but engage in reparations. And there are movements here in the United States like the Red, Black, and Green New Deal, but there are movements around the world for a People's Green New Deal that do understand the need for a decolonizing, caring, and reparative transformation. So yeah, decolonize, care, and repair.
Love it. Well, you did an amazing job at taking on a big question in true rapid fire action, and were we able to live in such a world, how beautiful that would be. So in the last minutes together, did just want to open it up to either of you. Did anything come up during this session that you felt like you wanted to re-underscore, re-emphasize with everybody before we send you beautiful people off into the world, possibly to see other sessions as part of this conference? Certainly, we encourage you all tomorrow, 7 p.m. GMT, to tune in to watch Raj's film, The Ants and the Grasshopper, and he'll join for a Q&A after. But yeah, any final words from either of you? I've really enjoyed the conversation, and thank you for such engagement in the chat and the Q&A, all of you tuning in.
I guess I would just want to leave people with the connection between food and medicine, as deep as it is, that these things have been extricated for a reason and placed in separate spheres to keep us disempowered. And so when we bring those things together, whether it's in a community garden, whether it's in our neighborhoods, bringing people around food, when we start blurring the lines that have been drawn to keep us separated, there's great power in coming together like that. And it's so critical that we do this work right now. And I just want to wish everyone all the best of health as we ride through this surge. To take care of each other, to look out for people in your community who need support and help and to organize.
Thanks, Rupa.
And
anything you want to add?
Well, I certainly want to emphasize that going to deepmedicinecircle.org is a thing that you should do, because I'm the treasurer of that organization. And so it is my fiscal duty to encourage you to donate to it, but also because the work that is happening on that farm in the circle that connects through Rupa is so important. And it is about, I mean, look, when we talk about decolonizing and white supremacy, and for folk who are white, for folk who find themselves on stolen land, this can feel like another sort of woke, bloody, duty. And it's not. These are the sort of duties of liberation. These are the paths to freedom. Is not to run away from this, but actually to recognize that there can be joy in decolonizing, in fighting patriarchy, in fighting white supremacy, and these are things in which we are, to some degree, conscripted, but also to which we are therefore, we are benefited from, and we can joyfully liberate ourselves from. And that's the great joy of being in a circle, is that you don't have to, and you can't do it alone, but you can do it together, and it can be it can be a liberation unlike anything you've experienced before. And that's the world that we need to be heading towards. And I'm so grateful to be in that circle with y'all.
Thank you, Raj. Thank you so much, both of you. Thank you, Rupa. Again, this is the book that has fueled much of this conversation, Inflamed, Deep Medicine and the Anatomy of Injustice. We wish you all well. And Rupa, as you head back into the hospital, stay safe. Thank you for the work you do there. Raj, stay safe and healthy in, in Austin, Texas. And again, thank you all so much for joining us. And thank you, Oxford Real Farming Conference, for bringing all of us together in conversation. Thank you
Anna,
so much
for another awesome conversation. Thank you, Raj.
Yeah, we'll see if we have a virtual year 3. All right. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.